How dare you challenge my integrity? This entire proceeding is a sham, and you will regret this insolence.
The air inside courtroom 4B wasn't just cold. It was heavy with a kind of tension that makes your skin crawl. You know that feeling, don't you? It's the silence right before a massive storm hits, the kind of silence that tells you someone is about to lose everything. At the center of this storm was Judge Boyd, a man whose face looked like it was carved out of ancient granite. He didn't just sit on that bench, he commanded it. He was the barrier between the law and the chaos of the powerful. But today, that barrier was being pushed to its absolute breaking point. Across from him stood Senator Edward Sterling. Now, if you've lived long enough, you know the type. Sterling wasn't just a politician, he was an institution. He walked with a stride that said he owned the sidewalk, the building, and the people inside it. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than most people's annual pension, and his eyes carried the arrogance of a man who had spent 30 years buying his way out of trouble. This wasn't a typical hearing. This was a clash of titans. The courtroom was packed. Journalists were leaning forward, their pens hovering over their pads. The public gallery was a sea of anxious faces, ordinary people who had seen enough corruption to last a lifetime, all of them secretly hoping, praying, that for once the scales of justice wouldn't tilt toward the rich. Senator Sterling was there to testify in a high-stakes racketeering case involving his top donors. To anyone else, it was a legal proceeding. To Sterling, it was an inconvenience, a fly to be swatted away. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the flag. He looked directly at Judge Boyd with a smirk that was nothing short of an insult. It was a smirk that said, "I am the one who makes the laws you're trying to use against me." Senator Sterling, Judge Boyd's voice cracked through the room like a whip. It wasn't loud, but it had a weight to it that made the room grow even quieter. You are here to answer questions under oath. This is a court of law, not a campaign rally. If you continue to treat these proceedings with contempt, I will be forced to take measures you will not find pleasant. Sterling laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "Judge, let's be real. You're a local appointee. I'm a United States Senator. I've survived 3 administrations and more scandals than you've had cases. Don't lecture me on the law. I am the reason you have a job." The gallery gasped. You could hear the sharp intake of breath. In that moment, the terhuit of pride, the ultimate ego, was on full display. Sterling wasn't just defending himself, he was asserting his dominance over the very idea of justice. He believed his title was a shield, a suit of armor that made him invincible. He thought he could walk into Boyd's house and spit on the floor. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly understand, is that Judge Boyd didn't care about titles. To Boyd, a senator was just another citizen, and a criminal was just another man standing in the way of the truth. Boyd leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The cameras were rolling, capturing every micro-expression of Sterling's arrogance. This was the moment the power fantasy began to shift. The audience at home, watching the live feed, felt that familiar burn of anger. We've all seen it, haven't we? The elite, looking down their noses at us, thinking they are untouchable. But today, the rules were about to change. "Senator," Boyd said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously calm, "in this room, the only title that matters is the court. You have 10 seconds to sit down and answer the council's question, or I will find you in summary contempt. Your choice, your legacy. 10 seconds starts now." Sterling's face turned a deep, bruised purple. His hands clenched the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned white. He wasn't used to being told what to do. He wasn't used to the word no. The arrogance that had fueled his career for decades was now boiling over into something much more dangerous, uncontrollable rage. He looked at the bailiffs, then back at Boyd. He thought he saw fear in Boyd's eyes. He was wrong. He was seeing the cold, hard reflection of his own downfall. The clock was ticking. The world was watching. And in 30 seconds, the senator was about to make a mistake that would haunt the history books forever. The courtroom held its breath as the final seconds of Judge Boyd's ultimatum ticked away. You could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, each beat sounding like a hammer striking a nail into a coffin. Senator Edward Sterling didn't move. He stood there, his chin tilted upward, a man who had spent 40 years believing that the laws of gravity and the laws of men didn't apply to him. But then something shifted. It wasn't the sound of a gavel, it was the sound of Sterling's composure finally fracturing. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now wide with an indignant fury. This was the tuhuit of pride, the moment where a man's belief in his own untouchability becomes his greatest weakness. He looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, a lobbyist, a fixer, someone to make this uncomfortable reality disappear. But there was no one. There was only the cold, unyielding gaze of Judge Boyd. 5 seconds, Senator, Boyd whispered. The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling took a step forward. He didn't sit down. Instead, he slammed his hand onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. You think you can intimidate me? I've destroyed men twice as righteous as you before breakfast, Sterling hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He began to pace, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the hardwood floor, a predator trapped in a cage he didn't realize was locked. He turned to the gallery, shouting to the cameras, "This is a hit job, a political circus orchestrated by a small-town judge who wants a headline. Do you see this? This is what they do to your leaders." Judge Boyd didn't blink. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply signaled the bailiff to stand ready. "Senator, you are no longer a leader in this room. You are a witness who is refusing to comply with a judicial order. The time for speeches is over." This was the pain point, the realization that your title is just paper when you're standing in front of a man who values the truth more than a political favor. Sterling stopped pacing. He turned back to the bench, his face inches from the microphone. The smirk was gone, replaced by a snarl of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You want an answer, Boyd? Here's your answer." Sterling leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing growl that the microphones barely caught. "The day you try to put me in a cell is the day this city burns. I have files on people who make you look like a saint. You touch me, and the world finds out who you really are." It was a classic move, the threat of the elite, the secret weapon of the corrupt. But Sterling had miscalculated. He thought Boyd was playing the same game of shadows and leverage. He didn't realize that Boyd's only file was the Constitution. The tension in the room was now a physical weight. The journalists were typing furiously, their fingers flying across keys. The public was on the edge of their seats, sensing that the line of no return had just been crossed. Sterling, feeling the rush of his own perceived power, felt he had won. He thought he saw Boyd hesitate. He took another step toward the bench, invading the judge's personal space, a violation of every rule in the book. "Sit down," Boyd commanded one last time. But Sterling was beyond listening. He was consumed by the God complex that plagues the powerful. He didn't see the law anymore. He only saw an obstacle. And he was about to do the one thing that no one, not even his high-priced lawyers, could fix. He was about to turn a legal dispute into a physical assault. The air was charged with static. The countdown to the 30 seconds of chaos had begun, and the senator was leading the charge into his own ruin. The air in the courtroom didn't just feel heavy anymore. It felt like it was made of lead. Senator Sterling was no longer a man of reason. He was a man drowning in his own perceived superiority, and Judge Boyd was the anchor pulling him down. You've seen this before in the eyes of those who think they are gods, a flicker of something primal, something dangerous. Sterling took one step too many. He bypassed the mahogany barrier, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unbridled hatred. "You insignificant little clerk," Sterling spat, his voice no longer a growl but a jagged edge. "You want to talk about the law? I'll show you who the law is." And then it happened. A moment that would be replayed a million times on every news cycle across the globe. In a flash of motion that defied his age, Sterling lunged forward. His hand swept through the air, a heavy, gold-ringed hand, and connected with the side of Judge Boyd's face. Crack. The sound was sharp, sickeningly clear in the silent room. It wasn't just a slap. It was a declaration of war against the judicial system itself. For a heartbeat, time stopped. The gallery froze. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, paralyzed. Even the dust motes in the shafts of light seemed to hang suspended in disbelief. Senator Sterling stood there, chest heaving, his hands still stinging from the impact. A smug look of, I finally did it, beginning to crawl across his lips. He thought he had asserted his dominance. He thought he had finally put Boyd in his place. But Judge Boyd didn't fall. He didn't even flinch after the initial blow. He slowly turned his head back to center, his gaze locking onto Sterling's with the cold intensity of a predator who had just seen his prey make a fatal error. A thin line of crimson appeared at the corner of Boyd's mouth, but his expression remained as unreadable as a tombstone. This was the tuhoyat of shame not for the judge, but for the senator. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Sterling's smirk began to wither as he realized the bailiffs weren't just standing there anymore. The 30-second clock hadn't just started. It was already halfway to zero. Officer, Boyd said, his voice terrifyingly quiet, devoid of all emotion, except a chilling finality. Secure the senator. Sterling's eyes widened. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He began to back away, his hands trembling. Wait, now. Hold on, you can't. I have immunity. I'm in the middle of a hearing. He looked around frantically, but the shield of authority he had worn for decades had vanished. In its place was a vacuum of accountability. The bailiffs moved in, not with the hesitation they might show a public official, but with the cold efficiency of men serving a higher power. This was the justice fantasy becoming a reality. The senator was about to learn that in Boyd's court, a slap wasn't just a battery, it was a political suicide note written in real time. The cameras didn't miss a second. Every American watching felt that surge of revenge logic, the deep, visceral satisfaction of seeing an untouchable elite finally, irrevocably, cross the line and pay the price. The echo of the slap was still vibrating through the rafters of the courtroom when the atmosphere shifted from shock to a cold, surgical precision. Senator Sterling stood frozen, his hands still half raised, his breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. For a split second, he looked at Judge Boyd, expecting to see fear, expecting to see the judge crumble under the weight of his political stature. But what he saw instead was the beginning of his own extinction. Judge Boyd's eyes weren't just cold. They were the eyes of a man who had already passed judgment. 30 seconds, Boyd's voice whispered through the microphone, sounding less like a human and more like the inevitable tolling of a bell. Get your hands off me, Sterling shrieked as the first bailiff reached for his arm. The senator lunged back, nearly tripping over the mahogany chair he had so arrogantly occupied moments before. Do you know who I am? I have the governor on speed dial. I will have your badges by sunset. You are making the biggest mistake of your lives. It was a desperate plea to a world that no longer existed. In this room, the senator was gone. There was only a defendant who had committed a violent felony in open court. The bailiffs didn't hesitate. They didn't look at his gold watch or his bespoke suit. They saw a threat. The first hand gripped Sterling's shoulder, a firm, undeniable pressure that signaled the end of his freedom. Senator, do not resist, the officer warned, his voice a low drone against Sterling's frantic yelling. But Sterling was a man possessed by the God complex. He tried to shove the officer away, his face turning a shade of purple that looked like a dying ember. I am an elected official of the United States, he roared, spit flying from his lips. You cannot touch me. Then came the sound that everyone in the gallery and the millions watching at home had been waiting for. Click. The first cuff snapped shut around Sterling's right wrist. The metallic sound was a symphony of accountability. It was the justice fantasy manifesting in real time. Sterling's voice hitched, a high-pitched sob of disbelief escaping his throat. For the first time in 40 years, he felt the cold, unyielding bite of steel against his skin. This wasn't a political debate. This wasn't a negotiation. This was the law, stripped of its niceties and reduced to its rawest form. Judge Boyd leaned back, his shadow stretching long across the bench, looking down at the struggling man like a king observing a fallen rebel. 20 seconds, Boyd noted calmly. The second bailiff moved in, pinning Sterling's other arm behind his back. The senator's knees buckled. The man who had walked into the room as a giant was now being forced to the floor, his expensive suit wrinkling against the hardwood. The tuhoyat of pride was being crushed under the weight of the very system he thought he owned. As the second cuff clicked into place, the room fell into a silence so profound you could hear the senator's frantic, shallow breathing. The 30 seconds were almost up. and the world Edward Sterling knew was gone forever. The courtroom was no longer a place of debate. It had become a theater of absolute accountability. Senator Sterling was no longer struggling. He couldn't. The weight of the two bailiffs, combined with the cold, biting reality of the steel around his wrists, had sucked the air right out of his lungs. He sat on the floor, his legs sprawled out, looking less like a powerful legislator and more like a broken marionette whose strings had been cut by a single stroke of justice. You could see it in his eyes, that vacant, glass-like stare of a man whose brain is refusing to process the scene. This is what we call the ego death, when the tuhuiat of pride is shattered so completely that there is nothing left but a raw, shivering human being. Judge Boyd adjusted his glasses, the movement slow and deliberate, as if he were settling in to read a final chapter. Senator, Boyd began, his voice echoing with a judicial weight that felt heavier than the ceiling itself. You spoke earlier about files. You spoke about immunity. You spoke about the governor. Boyd leaned forward, his shadow engulfing the fallen senator. Look around you. Do you see the governor here? Do you see your donors? Do you see your untouchable legacy? He paused, letting the silence scream the answer. No. You see a courtroom. You see a record. And you see a man who just committed a violent felony in front of a dozen high-definition cameras. Sterling tried to speak, but his voice came out as a thin, pathetic rasp. I can fix this. This is a misunderstanding. It was the bargaining stage of a fallen giant. He was still trying to find a loophole in a room where the holes had all been plugged by his own hand. He looked up at the gallery, perhaps hoping for a sign of support, but all he saw were the stony faces of the public and the relentless lenses of the press. The people who had feared him for decades were now watching him with something worse than hatred. They were watching him with pity. That is the ultimate pain point for a man of Sterling's stature, to be pitied by those he once looked down upon. There is no fixing this, Edward, Boyd said, dropping the formal title for the first time. It was a verbal execution. You didn't just slap a man today. You slapped the face of the people you were sworn to serve. You proved every dark suspicion the public has about the elite, that you think you are better than them, that you think the rules are for other people. Boyd stood up, his black robes billowing like the wings of a dark angel of justice. The 30 seconds are over. You are now officially a ward of the state. Take him away. As the bailiffs hoisted Sterling to his feet, his bespoke jacket torn and his tie askew, the senator finally broke. A single, heavy sob escaped him, not a sob of regret for what he had done, but a sob of terror for what was coming. The justice fantasy had reached its climax, and the secret was out. No one is above the law when the law is held by a hand that cannot be bought. The doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a violent thud. But it wasn't a herald of freedom. It was the beginning of a media feeding frenzy that the world hadn't seen in decades. As the bailiffs led a handcuffed Senator Sterling through the hallway, the flashing lights of 100 cameras transformed the corridor into a strobe-lit nightmare. This is the tuhuiat of public shame, the moment where the private arrogance of the elite is dragged into the unforgiving light of the masses. Sterling, who only an hour ago believed he was the architect of the law, was now nothing more than a lead story on a 24-hour news cycle. He tried to hide his face, ducking his head behind his shackled hands, but there was no hiding from the reality he had created with a single, impulsive slap. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to a surreal, buzzing energy. Judge Boyd remained on the bench, as immovable as a mountain. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the frantic lawyers scrambling to file emergency motions. He simply looked at the empty chair where a United States senator had just forfeited his career. The law does not have a memory for titles, Boyd murmured to the court clerk. It only has a memory for actions. This was the core truth, the secret that the powerful spend billions trying to suppress, that at the end of the day, the black robe of a judge carries more weight than the gold pins of a politician if the man wearing it refuses to be intimidated. By the time Sterling reached the transport vehicle, his world had already begun to dissolve. His speed dial to the governor went unanswered. His top donors were already issuing statements of shock and disappointment, distancing themselves from the man they had funded for years. This is the cold reality of the power structure. Once you are no longer a winner, you are a liability. The senator was learning that his untouchable status was a house of cards, and Judge Boyd had just blown the first gust of wind. The phones in the senator's office were ringing off the hook, not with messages of support, but with federal investigators asking for access to his private servers. The slap hadn't just been an assault on a judge. It had been the key that unlocked a Pandora's box of corruption that Sterling had kept hidden for a lifetime. Back in the gallery, the ordinary citizens began to stand up, a sense of quiet triumph filling the room. They weren't cheering, it was too somber for that, but they were nodding. They had just witnessed a miracle in the modern age, a man of immense power being treated like a common criminal because he had behaved like one. This was the justice fantasy manifesting as a cultural reset. As the transport van pulled away from the curb, flanked by police escorts, the image of Sterling's tear-streaked face pressed against the reinforced glass became the defining image of the decade. The senator thought he was going to a hearing. Instead, he was heading toward a cage of his own making, and the 30 seconds that ruined him were just the beginning of a very long, very dark night. As the sun began to set behind the heavy stone pillars of the courthouse, the world inside Judge Boyd's chambers was eerily quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that follows a landslide where the dust is still settling over everything that was once standing. Senator Sterling was no longer in the building. He was being processed in a federal holding cell, stripped of his belt, his gold watch, and his dignity. But the battle wasn't over. You see, a man like Sterling doesn't fall alone. He is the center of a web, and when the spider is crushed, the web begins to vibrate with the panic of 1,000 smaller insects. This is the tuhuyet of fear, the terror that grips those who thought they were safe behind a curtain of political influence. Judge Boyd sat at his desk, the only light coming from a small shaded lamp that cast long, sharp shadows across the room. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't the bailiff. It was a man in a dark coat, a fixer for the party, someone whose face never appeared on a ballot, but whose hand guided the pen of history. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply sat down and placed a folder on the desk. "You've had your fun, Boyd," the man said, his voice as cold as a grave. "You've made your point. But Sterling is too big to fail. The governor is unhappy. Washington is livid. Dismiss the assault charges as a mental health episode, and this all goes away. Your promotion to the Supreme Court is still on the table." Judge Boyd didn't look at the folder. He didn't even look at the man. He picked up his pen and continued writing his notes for the morning's arraignment. This was the ultimate test of the justice fantasy, the moment where the hero is offered the world in exchange for his soul. "The senator didn't have a mental health episode," Boyd said, his voice cutting through the man's threats like a diamond through glass. "He had a reality check. And as for the governor, tell him that if he wants to interfere with a criminal proceeding, he's welcome to come down here and sit in the same chair Sterling occupied. I have plenty of handcuffs left." The fixer stood up, his face reddening. "You're a dead man walking, Boyd. You won't just lose your job, you'll lose everything." But as the door slammed shut, Boyd finally looked up. There was no fear in his eyes, only a weary satisfaction. He knew that the secret of power is that it only works if you're afraid to lose what it offers. By slapping the judge, Sterling hadn't just committed a crime. He had broken the spell of his own invincibility. The files that Sterling had threatened to use were already being leaked by his own panicked staff, desperate to cut deals with the feds. The senator had spent a lifetime building a fortress of corruption, only to realize that he had locked himself inside it. The 30 seconds of chaos were now a lifetime of consequences, and Judge Boyd was ready to oversee every single one of them. The justice fantasy was no longer a dream. It was the cold, hard floor of a prison cell, and the harvest of Sterling's greed was finally ready for the reaping. The courtroom was empty now. The reporters had long since departed to file their career-making stories, and the protesters outside had moved their chants to the front of the federal lockup. Only Judge Boyd remained, standing by the window of his chambers, watching the moonlight reflect off the cold, indifferent marble of the city's monuments. Senator Edward Sterling, once a titan of the Senate, was now just a number in a database, a man who had traded his legacy for a moment of unchecked ego. The tuhuyet of legacy is the most painful of all. To realize that after 40 years of climbing, you will be remembered not for the laws you passed, but for the handcuffs you wore. In the quiet of the night, the fixer's folder still sat unopened on Boyd's desk. It represented everything wrong with the system, the backroom deals, the hollow promises, the belief that justice is a commodity to be traded. Boyd picked it up and, without a second thought, fed it into the shredder. The mechanical hum was the final punctuation mark on Sterling's career. You see, the secret that the powerful never want you to know is that their influence only exists as long as the people in the black robes are willing to look the other way. Today, Judge Boyd looked straight ahead, and the illusion of Sterling's invincibility vanished like smoke in a gale. Months later, the headlines would fade, but the precedent remained. Sterling was sentenced to the maximum term, his pleas for leniency falling on deaf ears. He would spend his final years in a concrete cell, a far cry from the silk-lined halls of Washington. But for Judge Boyd, this wasn't about revenge. It was about the justice or fiction boundary. As he walked back into the silent courtroom one last time before heading home, he looked at the bench. He saw the spot where the senator had stood, the spot where the slap had occurred, and the spot where the law had finally, irrevocably, asserted itself. "The court is adjourned," Boyd whispered to the shadows. It was a message to every other elite who thought they could walk into his house and spit on the Constitution. The story of Judge Boyd and Senator Sterling became a modern legend not because a judge was attacked, but because the system worked when it mattered most. It was the ultimate reversal for a nation that had grown cynical about accountability. As Boyd turned off the lights, leaving the courtroom in darkness, the message was clear to everyone watching across the globe. Titles may grant you power, but only integrity grants you authority. And in the court of Judge Boyd, authority is the only thing that never blinks. The 30 seconds of chaos had led to a lifetime of truth, and for once, the world felt like a place where the scales were perfectly, beautifully balanced.